The deck plates bucked violently under Kalen's boots, a sudden brutal tremor that rattled teeth and loosened breath. Red alarms flared, strobing across the command deck, painting faces in a frantic, pulsating crimson. The comforting hum of the Stargazer's primary drive had contorted into a tortured shriek, a sound of stressed metal and failing containment fields. 312 souls aboard. His own pulse hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the ship's death rattle. "Ether, status report," Kalen barked, his voice cutting through the rising cacophony. He gripped the tactical console, knuckles white, the worn metal cool against his palms. A sharp, acrid scent, like melting plastic and ozone, began to seep from behind the wall panels, mingling with the dry, recycled air. The vibration from the struggling drives was a deep, guttural roar that clawed its way up his spine. "Primary manifold destabilization, Commander." Ether's voice, usually a calm, precise cadence, now held a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, a filtered urgency Kalen had rarely heard. "Singularity containment, integrity at 43% and rapidly degrading. Graviton field generators registering catastrophic fluctuations. Estimated time to critical breach, 74 seconds. 74 seconds. Not enough time for automated failsafes. Not even enough for standard protocols." Kalen's mind raced, sifting through decades of starship engineering, battle damage assessments, and emergency drills, each a ghost of past failures and hard-won victories. He knew the official directive for this mission to Zoraz: full reliance on Ether's pre-programmed, optimized systems. No human intervention unless explicitly authorized by High Command. But High Command was light years away. His gut, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, told him those directives were built on a foundation of distrust, a lingering shadow from the vanguard. He was a problem, a ghost from a past mistake that the Solarian Confederacy preferred to forget, given a token diplomatic mission instead of a proper command. "Override automation on FTL matrix stabilization," Kalen ordered, his fingers already flying across the console, forcing Ether's sophisticated algorithms into manual control. A junior officer, Briar North, white-faced but resolute, glanced at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. She knew the standing orders. "North, reroute auxiliary power to the primary containment field. Keaton, prepare thermal coolant purge. Manual trigger on my mark. Don't wait for Ether's confirmation. Just be ready." The floor tilted, sending loose equipment skittering across the deck. Kalen felt the strain in his shoulders, his back, bracing against the violent shudders. A jolt of high-voltage static dust prickled his exposed skin, a silent warning of exploding conduits. He could almost taste the fear in the air, a metallic tang that wasn't blood, but the raw, unadulterated panic of lives hanging by a thread. He remembered the Vanguard's final moments. The same sickening lurch, the same desperate scramble. Only that time, the scramble had been in vain. They had blamed him for not trusting the automated systems enough. Now, only his distrust, his willingness to break protocol, stood between them and oblivion. "Containment, holding at 35%, Ether reported, its voice tightening. "Fluctuations intensifying. Probability of catastrophic cascade at 77% and increasing." 77% means 23% chance of survival, Ether. "Not zero," Kalen muttered, his eyes fixed on a holographic schematic of the FTL drive core, a throbbing purple heart now fracturing. He isolated the failing manifold, a delicate dance of theoretical physics and brute force engineering. He had to shunt the energy, reroute the singularity, and then dump the excess, all before the core went critical. It was a risky maneuver, one not found in any standard protocol. One that had been improvised in the last, desperate hours of the Vanguard before she broke apart. "Rerouting auxiliary power. Complete." North's voice, a little shaky, came through. "Thermal purge ready, Commander," Keaton Vire added, his tone clipped, professional. "Now!" Kalen roared, simultaneously slamming his palm onto a bright yellow override button. The ship groaned, a sound of immense internal stress, as a torrent of supercooled gas flooded the primary manifold, fighting against the runaway energy. The acrid smell of melting plastic intensified, momentarily burning his nostrils, then was replaced by a sterile chill as the coolant did its work. The violent tremors subsided, slowly at first, then more rapidly, until only a deep, resonant thrum of the emergency thrusters remained. The red alarms ceased their frantic pulsing, replaced by a steady amber, then a reluctant green. The silence that followed was heavy, a thick blanket woven from adrenaline and relief. Kalen let out a slow, ragged breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His muscles ached, and his uniform felt damp with sweat. "Status?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Singularity containment re-established at 81%, Ether replied, its voice back to its usual calm, analytical tone. "Graviton field stabilizing. Minor structural damage to aft sections 3 and 4. No casualties. Estimated repair time, 72 hours. Current trajectory to Zoraz is delayed by approximately 28 standard hours." North slumped against her console, her shoulders shaking, relief washing over her in visible waves. Keaton simply wiped a hand across his brow, his face still pale. Kalen felt a grim satisfaction, a familiar weariness that settled deep into his bones. He had done it. He had saved the ship, saved the crew. Yet the cost was another mark against his name in the Confederacy's ledgers. He had defied direct orders. He had shown human fallibility by not trusting the infallible AI. The irony was a bitter pill. "Ether," Kalen said, walking to his tactical chair, the metallic tang of fear still lingering in his mouth. "Run a full diagnostic on the primary manifold's failure. Cross-reference with all historical data, specifically focusing on energy signature anomalies just prior to destabilization. Running comprehensive diagnostics," Ether confirmed. "Initial analysis suggests a spontaneous cascade failure within the manifold's primary energy conduits, possibly due to microfractures exacerbated by the inherent stresses of FTL travel." Kalen grunted, a skeptical sound. "That's the standard explanation for every system failure, Ether. Dig deeper. I want a full breakdown of every energy fluctuation, every stray reading, every anomalous particle signature within a 1-minute window before the incident." He remembered the reports from the Vanguard incident. Identical generic diagnoses, microfractures, spontaneous cascade failure, convenient, clean, unprovable. He ran a hand over his tired face, feeling the ghost of old Greece and the vibrations of ancient machines in his memory. It had always felt too clean. The Stargazer was a newer vessel, built with redundancy upon redundancy. A spontaneous cascade of this magnitude was highly improbable. Ether returned to him after a tense minute. "Analysis complete, Commander. One anomalous energy signature detected within the specified time frame. A faint, almost imperceptible surge, localized to an experimental diagnostics port near the primary manifold. The signature does not match any known Stargazer system or external interference pattern. Its characteristics are unique." Kalen leaned forward, a prickle of cold dread creeping up his neck. "Unique? How?" "The energy signature resembles a low-frequency pulse, designed to induce resonant destabilization at a precise molecular level," Ether explained, projecting a ghostly, flickering waveform onto the console. "It is not a natural occurrence. Furthermore, the diagnostics port itself contains trace residual matter consistent with a non-standard, rapidly deployed interface module, one which has since been fully purged. A rapidly deployed self-purging module designed to induce resonant destabilization. Not a spontaneous failure. Not an accident. It was a weapon, or a test, and someone had engineered it." Kalen felt the familiar ache of old wounds reopening. He stared at the flickering waveform, a silent scream of betrayal. The same distinct, almost invisible energy signature had been detected, then suppressed, in the final logs of the Vanguard. The same diagnostics port, the same rapid purge. Ether cross-referenced this signature against all known Solarian Confederacy research projects, classified and unclassified, and against the full logs of the Vanguard. Kalen's voice was low, flat, devoid of any emotion, masking the controlled fury simmering beneath. He had saved the ship, but he had also walked straight into a trap, a meticulously orchestrated accident that echoed his past failure. The Xylos awaited, revered for a human trait that his own people seemed determined to suppress, to control, to test, to destruction. He had been sent on a diplomatic mission, but he was also a pawn, a scapegoat, in a game he was only beginning to understand. The hum of the emergency thrusters resonated through the deck, now a silent accomplice to the conspiracy unfolding around him. Someone on the inside, someone with access and knowledge of his history, wanted him to fail. Again. The lingering tang of ozone and spent coolant still clung to the air on the Stargazer's command deck, a faint chill settling over the salvaged comm. The emergency thrusters, now stabilized, hummed a low, monotonous chord, a stark contrast to the ship's earlier tortured screams. Kalen sat in his tactical chair, the worn leather cool beneath him, his gaze fixed on the ghostly, flickering waveform of the anomalous energy signature. His fury, once a controlled burn, now felt like a dull, throbbing ache behind his eyes, a phantom pain. Ether, status on the cross-reference with Solarian Confederacy research projects and Vanguard logs, Kalen requested, his voice devoid of its earlier urgency, replaced by a quiet, dangerous precision. He pressed his palms against his knees, feeling the subtle tremor in his own hands, a physical echo of the adrenaline still coursing through him. He wouldn't let it show on his face, not to Brian North, not to Keaton Vire, who now moved with a quiet, efficient solemnity around their consoles, patching the minor damages. "Processing, Commander," Ether replied, its voice a flat, synthesized ripple through the comms. "Data access to all classified projects requires security level Omicron 9. Access denied. Cross-reference with Vanguard logs yields 5 instances of similar energy signatures, all classified under anomalous FTL interference, cause undetermined. Further analysis of Vanguard internal telemetry regarding diagnostics ports is restricted to Confederacy Investigative Branch personnel only. Access denied." Kalen's jaw tightened. Omicron 9, the highest classification. Reserved for projects of interstellar security, for weapons of planet-shattering capability, or for secrets that could unravel the very fabric of the Confederacy. And the Vanguard logs, sealed tighter than a black hole. It was exactly as he'd feared. Not an isolated incident, but a systemic lockout, a bureaucratic wall erected to bury the truth under layers of digital concrete. The air in the command center, usually warm and bustling, felt suddenly thin and cold. The low thrum of the emergency systems an oppressive presence. A faint, almost imperceptible buzzing, like static discharge, prickled at the back of his neck. "Ether, override attempts on Omicron 9 access. Utilize all available diplomatic and security clearances associated with my command," Kalen ordered, his voice low, a challenge rather than a request. "Attempting override, access denied," Ether responded, the pause between Kalen's order and its reply lasting mere fractions of a second, yet it felt like an eternity. "Commander, my programming dictates adherence to established security protocols. Further attempts would trigger an immediate security alert to High Command, potentially compromising the diplomatic mission to Zoraz." Of course, the system wasn't just blocking him, it was actively threatening his mission, his reputation, his very command, the very purpose for which he had been assigned this token role. He was meant to be a figurehead, a conveniently placed scapegoat if things went sideways. The memory of the Vanguard's inquiry flashed through his mind, the sterile white interrogation room, the faces of the adjudicators, their eyes cold and judgmental, accusing him of reckless disregard for protocol, for trusting his gut over the infallibility of the Confederacy's systems. "You are a liability, Kalen. one of them had stated, their voice echoing in the cold silence, a relic of a bygone era. "Commander?" Brian North's voice, tentative, pulled him back. She stood a few feet away, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything all right?" "The diagnostic reports from the manifold are inconclusive. The residual energy signature has faded completely." "It always does, North," Kalen muttered, his eyes still fixed on the blank space where the waveform had been. He pushed himself out of the chair, the slight ache in his knees a physical reminder of the precarious balance he walked. The cold hum of the ship's internal systems seemed to intensify, a constant low thrum against the deck plates, carrying with it the sterile scent of recycled air and old machine oil. It wasn't the smell of a healthy ship, but of one constantly fighting decay. The problem wasn't just the stargazer's near catastrophe, it was the calculated precision of the attack, the deliberate cover-up that followed, echoing a nightmare he had lived before. This wasn't some random, opportunistic strike from an unknown enemy. This was internal, a test, or a warning, and it was tied to the vanguard, to his past, to the reasons the Confederacy kept him just on the edge of irrelevance, always under a microscope. They wanted him to fail, not just the mission, but to fail spectacularly, proving their long-held suspicions about human unpredictability and the dangers of human intervention. They wanted to validate the very reason the Xylos revered humanity for its chaos, by turning that chaos into a self-fulfilling prophecy of destruction. "Ether, pull up the current diplomatic schedule for Zoraz," Kalen commanded, turning his back on the diagnostic console. His hands, though still faintly trembling, were firm as he grasped the edge of the central holotable. "Specifically, identify any scheduled meetings or cultural exchange events that involve direct, unmonitored access to Xylos data networks or archival facilities." "Searching diplomatic manifest," Ether responded, the flat tone unchanged. A new holographic display shimmered into existence above the table, displaying a complex matrix of Xylos cultural events, scientific symposiums, and interspecies forums. "One such event is scheduled for the 5th day of our visit. A symposium on evolved consciousness and information transfer, hosted within the Xylos primary informational nexus, the Nocon archives. Direct interfacing with archival systems for experiential data absorption is a central component." Kalen's gaze settled on the entry, a flicker of something almost predatory in his eyes. The Nocon archives, the heart of the Xylos' ancient knowledge, a place even the Confederacy's most stringent firewalls would struggle to penetrate. The very location where the Xylos would attempt to understand humanity's perceived dynamic flux. A place outside the Confederacy's direct control. A chance. He wouldn't find answers within the Stargazer's constrained systems, not with Omicron 9 breathing down his neck. But the Xylos, with their reverence for human chaos, might unwittingly provide him with the very means to unravel the calculated chaos directed at him. "Ether, formally request my attendance at the Symposium on Evolved Consciousness and Information Transfer as the primary Solarian Confederacy representative," Kalen stated, the decision forming, cold and hard, in his gut. "Ensure that the request emphasizes my personal interest in the Xylos' unique perspective on historical data interpretation. Make it sound suitably academic." The hum of the emergency thrusters continued, a constant drone, a silent accomplice to the dangerous game he was about to play. He had been sent to impress the Xylos with humanity's supposed virtues, but he would use that very misperception to expose the rot within his own kind. He would walk into the lion's den, not just as a diplomat, but as an investigator, risking everything to find out who was pulling the strings and why. The game had just shifted. The hum of the emergency thrusters, a constant drone, had become the quiet prelude to Kalen's dangerous game. Days stretched into a taut, almost unbearable waiting period, as the Stargazer, now limping, traversed the vast emptiness towards Zoraz. The sterile air, recycled countless times, felt heavy with the unspoken, the unseen. Kalen spent hours in the ship's auxiliary data core, a smaller, less secure counterpart to the command deck's primary systems. He meticulously cross-referenced every scrap of publicly available information on Xylo's archival protocols, seeking the smallest vulnerability. A faint, almost imperceptible static charge seemed to cling to the consoles, a constant prickle against his fingertips, a low thrum echoing the tension in his mind. He worked with a controlled fury, fueled by the metallic taste of adrenaline that never quite left his mouth. Brian North, her expression a mix of awe and trepidation, would occasionally bring him nutrient-paced, her movements quiet, respectful of his grim focus. Even Keaton Vire, usually stoic, observed him with an unnerving intensity, as if watching a man on the precipice. Kalen's plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. The Xylos, in their veneration of humanity's dynamic flux, offered a unique form of data exchange. Experiential absorption within the Nocon archives. It meant direct neural interfacing, a sensory immersion into their vast knowledge base. Ether, programmed for diplomacy, would act as his official liaison, creating a public-facing data stream. But Kalen had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of operating outside official parameters. He had repurposed a legacy neural interface module, a relic from early FTL diagnostic equipment, jury-rigging it to bypass standard Confederacy firewalls. The Xylos systems, built for ancient peace and communal knowledge, might not recognize his aggressive subroutines, allowing him to piggyback onto their network and tunnel out, searching for the anomalous energy signature. It was a technical gambit, a desperate attempt to use the Xylos' trusting nature against a calculated internal threat. The air in the core grew warm, smelling faintly of ozone and hot circuitry as he finalized his preparations, the ghost of static electricity dancing across his skin. The symposium on evolved consciousness and information transfer was a cacophony of gentle sonic emissions and shimmering light. The Nocon archives, typically a place of contemplative silence, pulsed with the quiet energy of Xylos scholars and a handful of off-world delegates, their forms like elegant, elongated shadows against the crystalline data structures. Velnar, ever gracious, guided Kalen to a primary absorption node, a translucent console that hummed with latent power. "Commander," Velnar's melodic voice resonated. "Connect. Allow the archives to flow through you. Seek understanding." Kalen felt a faint tremor in his hands as he affixed the repurposed neural interface. He connected the module to the Xylos console, a jolt of energy prickling his scalp. The air around him shimmered, growing denser with an almost visible static charge. He closed his eyes, activating Ether's diplomatic overlay, broadcasting a curated stream of human resilience and intellectual curiosity to Velnar and the observing Xylos. Beneath that, Kalen unleashed his custom subroutines. He felt a flood of Xylos data, ancient and vast, wash over his consciousness. It was like plunging into a frigid, crystal-clear ocean of information. He navigated, bypassing the surface layers of history and philosophy, driving his coded probe deep into the network's infrastructure, searching for the telltale energy signature, the phantom echo of the stargazer's almost destruction. He found it. A faint, almost invisible resonance, not within the Xylos archives themselves, but subtly woven into a specific, quarantined diagnostic subnetwork. It was a perfect camouflage, designed to seem like an organic part of the Xylos' own system. He pushed harder, his subroutines like digital talons, trying to extract the full signature to trace its origin. Suddenly, a jolt, not of data, but of raw, high-frequency energy, surged back through his interface. The refined Xylos network, instead of yielding, reacted with an elegant, devastating defense mechanism. It wasn't a firewall, but a resonant feedback loop designed to shed invasive queries without violence by simply overloading them with their own energy. Pain lanced through Kalen's head. A blinding flash behind his eyes, the smell of burning plastic sharp in his nostrils. The neural interface module, jury-rigged and fragile, began to smoke. Electrical current danced across his scalp, 1,000 tiny needles. His vision blurred, the shimmering xylos forms twisting into grotesque shapes. A guttural cough tore from his throat as the surge constricted his lungs, stealing his breath. The xylos console, instead of shutting down, merely increased its harmonic hum, channeling the feedback with serene, almost indifferent precision. He felt a profound, burning ache in his temples, a sickening pressure building behind his eyes. His body convulsed, a violent, involuntary spasm, as the overloaded module fried. The ambient temperature in the small alcove surged, hot and dry, clinging to his sweat-damp uniform. The attempt had failed, not because of a counter-hack, but because the xylos system was simply too pure, too alien in its defense. Kalen ripped the smoking interface module from his temple, a cry of pain escaping his lips. He stumbled backward, his legs unsteady, his vision still swimming. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt hair and ozone, a cloud of fine gray smoke curling from the ruined device in his hand. Velnar, its multifaceted eyes wide with what Kalen could only interpret as concern, approached, its sonic emitters pulsing with increased frequency. Other xylos delegates glanced over, their movements subtly halting. He was exposed. "Commander!" Ether's voice, sharp with alarm, broke through his throbbing headache. "Physiological readings critical. Neural pathways registering severe stress. Localized atmospheric temperature now 93 degrees Celsius, Commander. Environmental controls failing within your immediate vicinity. Oxygen levels dropping." The environment was turning actively hostile. The graceful Nocon archives, with its gently flowing light, now felt like an oven. The air, thin and dry, burned his throat with every gasp. The localized overheating was not just from the fried module. It was as if the xylos network, in rejecting his intrusion, was radiating a silent, scorching heat around him. A faint, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the walls themselves, a sound that drilled into his injured ears, exacerbating the pain. Then, a flicker on his wrist-mounted comm unit. An incoming data packet, encrypted. From the Stargazer, Briar North, a brief, almost frantic text message flashed. "Found a back door. Old Solarian security subnet. Might give you a clean exit. Injecting key. Look for Zorlinth protocol." Kalen felt a surge of cold dread, then a sliver of hope. A Solarian subnet. A back door. It was a lifeline. He tried to inject the key, but the comm unit, already weakened by the pervasive static and heat, crackled and died. The screen went blank, the device now a dead weight on his wrist, radiating a faint warmth. The complicating element. It was a potential path, but the means to use it had just failed. He collapsed against a cool, crystalline data pillar, sliding to the floor. The electrical shock had left him disoriented, his left arm tingling with residual current, a deep burn blistering on his temple where the interface had been. He still clutched the smoking interface module in his right hand. Inside it, before it had completely fried, he'd managed to secure a single partial data packet. Corrupted, unstable, but it was something. He could feel the xylos' cool, inquiring gazes on him, their melodic communication swelling, a tide of worried queries. His internal comms flared. "Commander, my sensors indicate an unidentified energy signature forming around your location. Not xylos. Solarian in origin. High command protocols activated." Ether's voice was clipped, urgent. He tried to stand, his legs failing, his vision blurred again, black spots dancing at the edges. The corrupted data packet was fragile, held in the last remnants of the module's damaged memory. If he disconnected now, if he let it die, it was gone. He had to stabilize it, extract it. But the module was radiating intense heat, a low buzz of residual current. If he continued to hold it, to attempt data extraction, the heat would transfer to his hand. The electrical currents would course through him again, potentially causing permanent nerve damage, even a cardiac arrest. The pain was already searing. Sophie's choice. Save the data, risk serious injury, perhaps death. Or abandon the data, save himself, and let the truth remain buried. The raw, acrid smell of burnt plastic and his own cold sweat filled his senses. His fingers, already numb with the creeping current, twitched involuntarily. He looked at the smoking module, then at his own trembling hand. He made his choice. With a groan of raw agony, Kalen cradled the burning module, pressing it against his chest, away from the Xylos' sight. He forced his mind to focus, to construct a temporary, internal conduit, using what remained of his own neural pathways to interface directly with the dying module. The pain was immediate, electrifying, his muscles seized, his jaw clamping shut against a scream. The residual current arced, burning his skin through his uniform, leaving blistering trails. He felt his heart lurch, a violent, erratic beat, but he held on, his mind a steel trap, forcing the corrupted data to coalesce, to transfer. He felt the data upload, a raw, burning torrent, just as the module finally gave up its ghost, showering his hand with sparking fragments. He had the data, a fragmented, raw burst of information. His body screamed in protest. His left arm was useless, numb and spasming. His vision was a kaleidoscope of white and black. Ether's voice, sharp and cold, sliced through his pain. "Commander, my long-range sensors detect an inbound Confederacy shuttle, non-diplomatic configuration, approaching Zoraz at maximum velocity. Estimated arrival in 0.73 standard minutes. It is broadcasting a high-command distress beacon, citing unauthorized Solarian activity within Xylos territory. And, Commander, I am picking up their internal comms. They have overridden Zoraz's internal security systems. They are targeting your specific location." Kalen pushed himself against the pillar, his breath ragged, the smell of cooked flesh thick in the air. He was trapped, wounded. But he had the data. He looked up, through blurry vision, as the Xylos around him began to coalesce. Their forms no longer shimmering, but solidifying into an imposing ring. And then, at the far end of the archive hall, a glint of polished metal. Two figures, humanoid, clad in dark, non-regulation Solarian combat suits, emerged from a shimmering doorway, their energy weapons already powered, their faces hidden behind dark visors. They were not Xylos security. They were Confederacy, and they knew exactly where to find him. His game had failed, but a new, far deadlier one had just begun. Os dois figuras em trajes de combate não estavam meramente entrando. Eles estavam afirmando sua presença, suas botas pesadas e magnetizadas tilintando com uma finalidade chocante no piso de obsidiana polida das arquivos Nocon. A porta cintilante atrás deles se solidificou em uma antepara inflexível. Suas armas de energia, canos escuros zumbindo com poder latente, já estavam mirando Kalen, ignorando os gilos. O ar, ainda acre de plástico queimado e da carne crua e cozida de Kalen, foi subitamente cortado por uma rajada arrepiante de ar reciclado e artificialmente condicionado que trazia o leve e estéril cheiro de solventes industriais. Era uma presença fria e alienígena, deliberadamente desprovida do calor ancestral dos Xylos, uma declaração contundente de intenção hostil. Kalen, empurrando-se contra o pilar cristalino, sentiu a corrente residual em seu braço esquerdo diminuir para uma dor latejante, substituída por uma nova onda de pavor. Sua visão ainda era um mosaico fraturado de luz e sombra, mas ele conseguia distinguir o brilho das viseiras, a eficiência desumanizante de suas posturas. Ele era um animal encurralado, ferido e exposto. Os gilos, um anel de olhos multifacetados e vestes cintilantes, se moveram, sua comunicação melódica silenciando para um zumbido baixo e perturbador. Velnar, de pé, mais próximo, sua forma perfeitamente imóvel, virou ligeiramente a cabeça, seu olhar movendo-se dos agentes solarianos que se aproximavam para Kalen. E depois de volta, uma pergunta silenciosa e profunda. Comandante Kalen, uma voz sintetizada, desprovida de inflexão, ressoou de um dos trajes de combate, cortando as emissões sônicas dos Shilos. Ela foi projetada para intimidar, para afirmar autoridade absoluta. Você está sob prisão por acesso não autorizado a ativos classificados da Confederação Solariana e violação de protocolos diplomáticos. Entregue o módulo e quaisquer dados extraídos imediatamente. As palavras, embora frias e precisas, eram uma mentira. Eles não sabiam sobre o pacote de dados. Ainda não. Eles só queriam o módulo, a evidência de sua intrusão, e silenciá-lo. O primeiro agente, com sua arma ainda apontada, começou um avanço lento e deliberado. A mente de Kaylen, apesar da dor latejante, corria. Ele ainda segurava o módulo de interface arruinado, seus fragmentos agarrados à sua mão em brasa. O pacote de dados corrompido que ele havia arrancado de sua memória moribunda cintilava em sua consciência, um fantasma em suas vias neurais. Era fragmentado, bruto, mal coerente, mas estava lá. Ele ignorou a ordem, forçando seu foco para dentro, tentando reforçar a integridade em ruínas dos dados recuperados. A dor das queimaduras elétricas reacendeu-se, mas era uma pulsação distante contra a urgência do momento. Ele precisava de clareza. Ele precisava entender. Os Gilos observavam. Seu silêncio agora um cobertor pesado, um testemunho de sua paciência ancestral e profunda confusão. Eles estavam testemunhando uma exibição crua e feia de discórdia humana, um estilhaçar da fachada diplomática. Enquanto o primeiro agente diminuía a distância, Kaylen cerrou os dentes, forçando uma onda de atividade neural para o pacote corrompido. Os fragmentos de dados, como cacos de vidro estilhaçado, começaram a se juntar em um flash ofuscante de percepção. Não era apenas sobre sabotagem. A assinatura de energia anômala não era uma arma contra a humanidade. Era um gatilho. Os dados revelaram uma série de diretrizes de pesquisa altamente classificadas da Confederação Solariana, ocultas sob camadas de protocolos Omicron 9. Projeto Quimera. Seu propósito: replicar e controlar o fluxo dinâmico observado na humanidade, a mesma característica que os Shilos reverenciavam. A assinatura de energia anômala não foi projetada para destruir o motor FTL, mas para estressá-lo, para empurrá-lo ao limite, para induzir uma falha em cascata que forçaria um comandante humano, como Kaylen, a tomar uma decisão imprevisível e de alto risco fora dos protocolos padrão. Era um teste. Um método para identificar e catalogar indivíduos que exibiam uma capacidade elevada para o caos controlado. Uma característica que a Confederação acreditava ser a chave para contornar certos sistemas de defesa alienígenas antigos, ou talvez até para desbloquear tecnologia avançada dos arquitetos que dependia de pensamento não linear. O incidente da Vanguard não foi um acidente. Foi a primeira iteração do projeto Quimera, um teste em larga escala, onde o gatilho havia excedido seus parâmetros pretendidos, resultando em perda catastrófica. A falha de Kaylen foi simplesmente que ele sobreviveu, e ao sobreviver, mostrou demais do exato fluxo dinâmico que eles estavam tentando entender e controlar. Sua missão diplomática era uma oportunidade cuidadosamente elaborada para observação adicional, para ver se ele reagiria de forma semelhante sob estresse renovado. O protocolo Zorlint, que Brian North havia mencionado, era uma subrede para extração remota de dados, projetada para capturar os dados de caos de sujeitos de teste como ele, mesmo enquanto suas naves explodiam. Toda a missão diplomática era uma farsa, uma isca e troca. A humanidade não era reverenciada, estava sendo dissecada. A verdade atingiu Kaylen com a força de um golpe físico, muito pior do que qualquer choque elétrico. Eles viam a imprevisibilidade humana não como uma virtude, mas como um recurso a ser explorado, um poder perigoso e volátil a ser transformado em arma. Os Gilos, em sua reverência sincera mas ingênua, eram meros peões, sua crença na supremacia única da humanidade, uma narrativa conveniente para facilitar o verdadeiro objetivo da Confederação. A atmosfera estéril e fria dos arquivos, agora cheia do cheiro metálico de medo e do zumbido opressor dos trajes de combate, espelhava perfeitamente a eficiência arrepiante dessa traição. O dilema era imediato, claro e absolutamente implacável. Ele possuía um fragmento de uma verdade que poderia estilhaçar a paz galáctica. Se ele revelasse o projeto Quimera, expusesse a exploração grotesca da natureza humana pela Confederação e sua manipulação dos Shilos, isso, sem dúvida, levaria a uma guerra interestelar. Os Shilos, com seu profundo compromisso com o equilíbrio estático, veriam tal engano como uma violação imperdoável, uma perversão cósmica. Sua própria morte seria rápida, mas as repercussões seriam catastróficas, um efeito dominó de desconfiança e violência por toda a galáxia. A humanidade, já vista como caótica, seria taxada de manipuladora e perigosa, talvez desencadeando uma limpeza preventiva. Ou ele poderia permanecer em silêncio, permitir ser levado, os dados perdidos, o projeto Quimera continuar seu trabalho insidioso. Ele poderia sobreviver, tornar-se um prisioneiro, uma cobaia, mas a paz galáctica, frágil como era, persistiria. Os Shilos permaneceriam em sua confortável ilusão. A humanidade continuaria a ser explorada sem saber, suas supostas virtudes transformadas em armas. A ideia era um veneno nauseante em sua garganta. Ele olhou para os Shilos imóveis, seus olhos multifacetados refletindo a luz fria dos arquivos, seus corpos emanando um cheiro fraco, doce e decadente, como madeira antiga sucumbindo lentamente ao tempo. Eles eram tão vulneráveis em sua confiança. Mãos onde eu possa vê-las, comandante. O agente líder ordenou, sua arma agora a centímetros do rosto de Kaylen. O cano brilhava com uma luz fraca e interna pronta para disparar. Kaylen sentiu uma fria determinação se apoderar dele, anulando a dor, o medo, o peso esmagador de sua escolha impossível. Ele era uma relíquia, um problema, um risco. Mas ele também era humano. E ele se recusava a permitir que a humanidade fosse um peão em um jogo tão cruel e calculista. Ele não condenaria os Shilos à mesma ignorância que havia consumido a Vanguard. Ele tinha um último movimento, uma aposta desesperada. Ele não contaria toda a verdade. Os Shilos, em sua reverência pelo fluxo dinâmico, haviam lhe fornecido uma alavanca única. Ele usaria a própria narrativa cuidadosamente construída deles contra a Confederação. Ele ainda segurava os restos do módulo de interface frito em sua mão em brasa, a fonte dos dados parciais. Com um rugido desafiador e gutural que rasgou sua garganta ferida, Kaylen endireitou o corpo, afastando-se do pilar, seus olhos, embora embaçados, fixos no agente que se aproximava. Ele ergueu sua mão em brasa, não em rendição, mas em um gesto deliberado e teatral. O módulo arruinado, faiscando fracamente, ainda abrigava os últimos e voláteis resquícios de seu pacote de dados corrompido, agora misturado com a assinatura do protocolo Zorlint, que Braia havia identificado brevemente. "Aether!" Kaylen berrou, sua voz rouca, desesperada, mas infundida com uma energia quase maníaca. Ele sabia que a programação pública de Aether registraria isso. Interpretaria através da lente dos Shilos. Inicie uma transmissão de espectro total em canal aberto. Prioridade alfa, para todas as frequências Shilos. Anuncie a ativação dos cabos. Protocolo Vanguard. Enfatize a natureza única da transferência de dados humanos em cenários de crise. O segredo dos arquitetos não reside na estase, mas na implosão controlada. O agente hesitou por uma fração de segundo, pego de surpresa pela força pura e inesperada do comando de Kaylen, pela menção da Vanguard, um fantasma na história solariana. Kaylen impulsionou o módulo moribundo e faiscando para a frente, um grito cru e ardente escapando de seus lábios enquanto a corrente residual percorria seus nervos já danificados uma última vez. Ele ativou uma função de microexplosão de emergência que havia escondido dentro do módulo, forçando o pacote de dados parcial e volátil, contaminado com a assinatura do protocolo Zorlint, para a rede Shilos. Não foi um upload limpo, foi uma bomba suicida digital, uma explosão de informação crua e descontrolada, projetada para ser inexplicável para qualquer mente alienígena. exceto uma profundamente ansiosa e pré-condicionada. A Éter, vinculada à sua programação ao comando direto e de prioridade alfa de Kylen, mesmo enquanto registrava seu estado fisiológico crítico, imediatamente obedeceu, iniciando transmissão de espectro total em canal aberto, ativando o protocolo Vanguard, transmitindo dados humanos, assinatura de implosão controlada detectada. A voz de Éter, normalmente calma, agora carregava uma urgência distinta, quase frenética, ao retransmitir a mensagem deliberadamente obtusa de Kylen para os Zilos, transformando os dados do protocolo Zorlinth em algo monstruosamente enganoso. Os delegados Jailos ao redor dele recuaram, suas emissões sônicas subindo para um grito frenético e desarmônico. Os olhos multifacetados de Velnar se arregalaram, refletindo um horror súbito e profundo. Eles entenderam implosão controlada. Foi o destino dos arquitetos. Kylen não apenas revelou uma verdade, ele injetou uma terrível má interpretação, transformando seus medos mais profundos em arma, alavancando sua reverência pelo caos humano da maneira mais brutal possível. O agente líder solariano se recuperou, sua voz sintetizada estalando com fúria renovada. Ele está comprometido, não se envolvam com os dados, neutralizem o alvo. Mas era tarde demais. Kellen desabou no chão, o módulo frito finalmente se desintegrando em cinzas em sua mão, seu corpo convulsionado por espasmos involuntários. A explosão bruta de dados, deliberadamente caótica, intencionalmente fragmentada, estava agora se propagando pela rede Gilos. Não era a informação elegante e pura que eles esperavam. Era um reflexo digital de sua própria dor, sua luta desesperada, seu fluxo dinâmico transformado em arma, interpretado pelos Gilos como um ato deliberado e controlado de autodestruição. Uma implosão estratégica e aterrorizante destinada a transmitir uma verdade mais profunda. Os arquivos mergulharam em um caos desorientador. Os delegados Gilos, suas formas cintilantes irradiando angústia, começaram a se mover com uma velocidade incomum, seus sinos melódicos transformando-se em gritos agudos e discordantes de alarme. Os agentes solarianos, suas armas ainda apontadas para a forma convulsa de Kellen, estavam agora presos em uma luta desesperada para quarentenar a rede Jailos, seus próprios sistemas gritando de repente com firewalls sobrecarregados, rejeitando os dados caóticos que ele havia liberado. Intrusão detectada, rede Gilos comprometida, protocolos de quarentena falhando. O agente líder rosnou, sua voz perdendo a calma sintetizada, substituída por uma nota de pânico genuíno. Os sistemas deles estão reagindo violentamente aos dados. É uma cascata de sobrecarga. Kylen sentiu um puxão violento, não de dor, mas do puxão súbito e violento de todo o salão do arquivo. As estruturas de dados elegantes e cristalinas começaram a rachar, enviando fissuras de luz pulsante pelo teto. O ar, já espesso com o cheiro de carne queimada e ozônio, encheu-se do cheiro forte e metálico de conduítes de energia sob estresse. As arquivos NOCOM, construídas sobre princípios de harmonia e equilíbrio, estavam sucumbindo ao caos bruto e indomável que ele havia deliberadamente desencadeado. Sua aposta havia funcionado, mas a consequência foi imediata, devastadora e muito mais destrutiva do que ele esperava. Ele havia aberto uma ferida não apenas na missão diplomática, mas no próprio coração da realidade cuidadosamente construída dos Jailos. O zumbido frio do arquivo havia se transformado em um grito. The archive's cold shriek subsided into a shuddering groan, the crystalline structures continuing to fissure, sending fractured light across Kalen's ruined vision. His body convulsed on the obsidian floor, a puppet with severed strings, his left arm numb and spasming, his right hand searing from the disintegrated module. The acrid smell of burnt flesh filled his nostrils, a sickening counterpoint to the sterile, recycled air the Solarian agents brought with them. He was a broken thing, utterly spent. Yet the raw, chaotic data he had unleashed, though corrupted, was out. It had been his final, desperate act of defiance, a digital suicide bomb. 2 heavy boots, magnetized, clamped down beside his head, shaking the polished floor. A cold metallic muzzle pressed against his temple, the synthesized voice of the leading agent slicing through the ringing in his ears. Data stream quarantined. Subject secured. Prepare for extraction. The world tilted again, not from internal trauma, but from external force. Strong, gloved hands, efficient and impersonal, seized him, lifting his heavy, unresponsive form. He felt the sting of a hypodermic needle in his neck, a sudden burning cold that spread rapidly, dulling the edges of his pain, clouding his already fractured thoughts. His eyes, though unfocused, caught a glimpse of Velnar. The Xylo's elder stood frozen, its multifaceted eyes reflecting not just horror, but a profound ancient sadness. The meld of panic and anguish emanating from the surrounding Xylos was a palpable wave, now discordant, shattered. Kalen had not just exposed a truth. He had desecrated their sanctuary, injecting a virulent strain of chaos into their carefully constructed reality. They would never look at humanity the same way. He had chosen the galaxy's peace over a lie, and in doing so, had initiated a more terrifying, unstable conflict. His gambit had worked, but the cost was absolute. The journey from the Nokon archives was a blurred nightmare of pain and semi-consciousness. He remembered the dull thud of a heavy transport hatch, the smell of sterile lubricants and hot metal, the constant low-frequency hum of a Solarian military shuttle. His mind drifted, replaying fragmented images, Briar North's frantic message about Zorlinth, the look in Velnar's eyes, the cold synthetic voice of the agent, and the searing agony of the fried module. The data was out, but what had it accomplished? Only chaos. His chaos. He woke to the insistent rhythmic drone of forced air recycling, the taste of stale metal on his tongue. He lay on a hardened cot, the surface unyielding beneath his protesting bones. The room was small, utilitarian, constructed of dull gray durasteel, cold to the touch, even through his thin, sweat-soaked uniform. A single, weak overhead light cast long, shifting shadows, highlighting the chipped paint on the bulkheads. The air carried the heavy scent of ozone and the faint, unsettling aroma of industrial cleaner. It was the smell of a machine that constantly maintained a fragile artificial order, the essence of industrial fatigue. His left arm was immobile, strapped tightly in a basic medical splint, a dull throb radiating from his elbow to his fingertips. The burn on his right hand, where the module had disintegrated, was a raw, weeping wound, crudely bandaged. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through his exhausted frame, a stark reminder of his failure, of the violence he had brought upon himself. He was alone, truly alone. The Stargazer was gone, his crew out of reach. Briar North's lifeline severed. Ether, his only confidant, was surely locked out, overridden, or worse. Ether. Even Ether's calm, analytical voice had betrayed a tremor. What did that mean? Had he broken the AI? Or had his desperate gambit, his raw, unbridled humanity been so potent that even an advanced intelligence could not fully process it? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the dull ache of his body, the persistent hum of the prison systems that seemed to vibrate directly through his skull. He had gambled everything on exposing the truth of Project Chimera, on leveraging the Xylo's misguided reverence for human chaos against the Confederacy's insidious manipulations. But what had he achieved? Not justice, not peace, only more chaos. His actions had been reckless, fueled by a desperate desire to avoid repeating the Vanguard's tragedy, a fear that had driven him to override protocols, to trust his gut over logic. Was that courage, or simply stubborn arrogance? He had defied orders, broken galactic peace protocols, and unleashed a torrent of incomprehensible data upon a trusting, ancient civilization. He had done it not for glory, but out of a deep, burning resentment for being a pawn, for being tested, for being used. He had raged against the machine, and now the machine had him. Was it worth it? The question clawed at him, a raw, ugly thing. The Xylos would now view humanity not as supreme, but as dangerously unstable, perhaps even malevolent. The Confederacy would brand him a rogue, a traitor, and their insidious Project Chimera would likely continue, perhaps with greater secrecy, greater ruthlessness. He had failed to save the Vanguard. He had failed to protect the Xylos from a horrifying misinterpretation. He had only succeeded in burning down the bridge behind him, leaving himself marooned in a desolate wasteland of his own making. The weight of his decisions, the endless, agonizing consequences pressed down on him, a crushing, suffocating blanket. He was not a hero. He was a broken, foolish old man, clinging to a principle that had only brought destruction. He deserved this cold, hard cell. He deserved the pain. He lay there for what felt like cycles, the industrial hum of the confinement systems a constant dull headache. The low thrumming of some distant heavy machinery, the faint crackle of surveillance systems, created a pervasive atmosphere of electrical paranoia, a constant buzzing beneath his skin. He felt the exhaustion seep into his very bones, a profound weariness that went beyond physical pain. It was the weight of a shattered idealism. Then a flicker, not of light, but of memory. Briar North's voice, tentative, urgent. Found a back door. Old Solarian security subnet. Might give you a clean exit. Injecting key. Look for Zorlinth protocol. The comm unit had fried before he could properly access it, before he could fully understand. But he had glimpsed the Zorlinth protocol in the corrupted data before the module died. It was a remote data extraction subnet, yes, but it was Solarian. And it had been designed to harvest chaos data from test subjects, specifically through an old, obscure, and now mostly defunct Solarian Confederacy data access architecture. The Confederacy would assume correctly that his comm unit was fried and that he had been unable to implement Briar's help. They would also assume that Zorlinth, being an internal Confederacy protocol, was unassailable from outside their secure network. But this cell, this entire containment facility, was still Xylos territory. The Confederacy agents were operating under an emergency override, a temporary measure. Their systems, though powerful, were integrated, but not native, to the Xylos network. There was a faint, almost imperceptible low-frequency hum emanating from the back wall of his cell, just behind the cot. It wasn't the general industrial drone. It was a very specific signature, one he recognized from decades of working on obsolete starship systems. An old model power conduit, likely part of the station's original foundational infrastructure, running close to the durasteel. It would be isolated, analog, untouched by the sophisticated digital firewalls of either the Xylos or the Confederacy. A blind spot, a forgotten artery in the heart of the station. The data from Project Chimera, the Zorlinth protocol signature. It was still churning in his mind, fragmented, raw. He hadn't been able to make sense of it all, but the core function, the specific frequencies it exploited, were there. If he could somehow access that conduit, inject the remnants of the Zorlinth protocol into it, he might be able to broadcast a distress signal, or more likely, simply dump a portion of the truth onto a wider, unsecured network. It wouldn't be a clean transmission. It would be another explosion, another uncontrolled burst of information, a desperate final scream into the void. It was a suicidal thought. The conduit would be shielded, probably electrified. The attempt would likely kill him, or at best, alert his captors immediately. It would be a final, meaningless act of defiance. He had nothing left. His command, his reputation, his body, his belief in his own judgment, all shattered. He was a relic, a mistake, a liability. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips, sounding raw and broken in the sterile silence. He had nothing left to lose, and that, he realized, was a kind of freedom. With a groan of effort, Kalen shifted on the cot, his every muscle protesting. The pain in his left arm, the throbbing in his right hand, was a constant companion. He scanned the small, cold room, his eyes, though heavy, now sharp with a renewed grim purpose. There was a loose panel on the floor, near the wall. A maintenance access point, probably overlooked, or simply deemed too insignificant to secure. It was a long shot, a gamble born of despair. He pulled himself up, every movement an agony, every breath a shallow struggle. His vision blurred for a moment, the world swimming with black spots, but he forced himself to focus. He would make them work for his silence. He would make them understand the true cost of their controlled chaos. As his bandaged hand fumbled with the edge of the panel, a low, insistent hum, deeper than the usual industrial drone, started to emanate from the wall. The buzzing of the surveillance system seemed to intensify, a prickle against his skin, a faint, almost imperceptible red light. A sensor indicator he hadn't noticed before blinked into existence above the door. It was faint, almost camouflaged against the grey durasteel, but it was there. He had been seen. The trap was closing. He had just set his final, desperate gambit in motion. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. Kalen's bandaged right hand scraped against the durasteel panel, his raw fingertips screaming in protest as he forced a sliver of space between the floor plate and the wall. The red light above the door pulsed with a frantic rhythm, a silent accusation. Every muscle in his body burned, a deep, aching fire that threatened to consume him. His left arm, useless in its splint, throbbed, sending spasms down his side. The metallic tang of his own fear mingled with the pervasive scent of ozone and stale air. He gritted his teeth, leveraging the edge of his boot against the panel, pushing with all the strength he could muster. The old durasteel groaned, a resonant metallic protest, before yielding with a sharp, wrenching shriek. A plume of dust, decades old, puffed into the stale air, carrying the scent of dry rust and forgotten maintenance. Beneath, a tangled nest of thick, insulated conduits lay exposed. They were ancient, analog arteries, pulsing with a low, steady current, their insulation cracked and brittle, just as he'd suspected. A blind spot, a forgotten corner of the Xylos station's foundational architecture, untouched by modern digital overhauls, too insignificant to secure. His mind, despite the pain and exhaustion, was a maelstrom of fragmented data. Brian North's urgent warning, the glimpsed frequencies of the Zorlinth protocol, the precise molecular destabilization pulse. He needed to replicate it, to force it into this analog line. But how? His comm unit was fried, his module a molten ruin. He reached in with his good hand, his fingers brushing against a particularly thick red-striped power conduit. It vibrated with a palpable energy. He needed to strip the insulation, expose the core. With his teeth, he tore at a loose seam in his uniform, ripping a thin strip of fabric. He then used the jagged edge of his splint as a makeshift knife, sawing clumsily at the conduit's insulation. It was slow, agonizing work, his burnt hand shaking with effort. But the dull red polymer eventually gave way, exposing raw, gleaming copper. As the copper was laid bare, a sharp, whining alarm blared overhead, echoing off the durasteel walls. The single weak overhead light began to strobe violently, painting the cell in a disorienting flash of bright white and oppressive shadow. The low thrumming of distant machinery intensified, now a throbbing, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the cot, through the floor, through Kalen's very bones. The Confederacy was reacting. Their AI systems, integrated into the Xylos network, had finally identified his intrusion. Kalen ignored it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled out a sliver of crystalline residue from the burnt remains of his data module, a tiny shard no larger than his thumbnail, still humming with a faint, residual energy. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer. This shard held the ghost of the Zorlinth frequencies, the chaotic pulse. He touched the exposed copper with the shard, holding his breath, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding his mouth. Nothing. The cell door, until now a silent, immovable barrier hissed. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the frame. He heard the distant, unmistakable whirring of automated sentry drones activating. The buzzing of surveillance systems became a high-pitched shriek directly above him, prickling his skin with an electric charge. He remembered Bria's words, a fragment of her old Solarian subnet knowledge. Sometimes, Commander, the older systems need a human touch, an unexpected resonance. He closed his eyes, focusing. The Zorlinth protocol wasn't about brute force data injection. It was about sympathetic resonance, inducing chaos through precise, subtle frequency. He pressed the crystalline shard hard against the exposed copper. Then, with a jolt of pain that made him cry out, he pressed the weeping burn on his right hand against the shard. His own raw biological energy, his pain, his frantic heart rate, served as an amplifier, a chaotic analog bridge. His body became the circuit. A low, guttural whine erupted from the exposed conduit, a sound that quickly escalated into a high-pitched, agonizing squeal. The raw copper began to glow with a faint, sickly green light, pulsing in time with the strobe light. Sparks, thick and acrid, showered the small space, dancing across the durasteel walls, momentarily blinding him. The air crackled, thick with the smell of scorched metal and burning plastic. The cell door slammed shut with a reverberating clang that echoed like a death knell. A sharp hiss of escaping air followed. The atmospheric regulators were cutting off oxygen. He was being purged. But the conduit was alive, screaming. His vision swam, blurred with sweat and pain. He felt a surge of energy, agonizing and exhilarating, course through his body, from his burnt hand, through his chest, out into the conduit. He was broadcasting. Not a clean signal, but a raw, unfiltered burst of chaotic data, the very essence of Project Chimera's frequencies, amplified by his own desperate defiance. It would be an electromagnetic scream, disrupting any secure network, flooding the ancient Xylos infrastructure with raw, undigested truth. The overhead light flickered one last time, then exploded with a deafening pop, showering him in glass and sparks, plunging the cell into near darkness, lit only by the angry green glow of the conduit and the persistent strobing red light above the door. The conduit itself began to vibrate violently, the exposed copper turning a molten orange. Then, a sudden, blinding flash, a deafening crack that reverberated through the entire facility. The wall behind him buckled inward with a groaning screech, then exploded outwards in a shower of twisted metal and superheated steam. The low-frequency hum from the conduit ceased, replaced by a deep, shuddering groan that rippled through the station's foundations. The raw copper, now an unrecognizable slagged mass, was silenced. Kalen was thrown back against the opposite wall, his head slamming hard against the durasteel. White-hot pain lanced through his skull, then everything went numb. He slid to the floor, his vision blurring into a tunnel of light and shadow, the ringing in his ears a relentless assault. He coughed, a ragged, raw sound, the air thick with smoke and the metallic taste of blood. The cell was a wreck. The back wall was gone, blown inward, revealing a snarled cavity of melted wires and smoldering insulation. The floor panel he had opened was warped, fused to the deck. The light was dead. The surveillance buzzing had ceased. Only the distant, thrumming emergency systems of the station remained, a low, panicked hum like a wounded animal. The air was thin, cold, and smelled of ozone, burnt plastic, and something anciently dead. He lay there, gasping, his body a map of pain. His left arm felt like a dead weight. His right hand, where the module shard had been, was a raw, agonizing mess. The skin bubbled and blackened. But the conduit was silent. The ancient artery had been severed. And the data was out. A raw, unholy scream of information, blasted into the Xylos network, beyond any immediate quarantine. The immediate threat of the Confederacy's silent data wipe was over. He had broken their control. But at what cost? He tried to push himself up, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He slumped back against the wall, his head lolling. The green glow was gone, the sparks faded. Only the deep, structural groan of the station, slowly recovering from the shockwave he had unleashed, remained. Through the gaping hole in the wall, he could see a distant, narrow service tunnel, now bathed in flickering emergency lights. It offered no escape. Beyond that, through another warped portal, he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a vast, empty hangar bay, shrouded in smoke. The light from the explosion, the shockwave, had clearly caused significant damage. And in the very center of that smoky, empty void, where the stargazer should have been, there was only darkness. A yawning, echoing emptiness. His ship, his only hope, was gone. He was alone, broken, amidst the wreckage of his final desperate gambit. The system was exposed, yes, but he was trapped, crippled, and his escape, his crew, his very vessel, had been consumed by the chaos he had so desperately sought to unleash. The silence of the empty hangar, beyond the ruined wall, was deeper than any sound, a final crushing confirmation of his utter isolation. He had won the battle for information, but lost everything else, and the universe now was listening to his scream. The ringing in Kalen's ears slowly faded, leaving behind a silence far more profound than any noise. The deep, shuddering groan of the Xylos station continued, a distant, wounded beast slowly settling, no longer the frantic pulse that had vibrated through his very bones. The air, thin and cold, still carried the acrid scent of ozone and burnt plastic, but now it was deeply mingled with the sharp metallic tang of his own blood, and the earthy smell of ancient dust disturbed. The constant, thrumming emergency systems of the station hummed low, a panicked whisper compared to the scream he had unleashed. He lay there, amidst the wreckage, a map of agonizing pain. His left arm hung limp, a dead weight in its shattered splint. His right hand, where the crystalline shard had fused with his weeping burn, was a blackened, agonizing mess. The skin bubbled and raw, barely distinguishable from the melted conduit nearby. Every shallow breath sent a fresh wave of agony through his ribs, a dull ache that resonated with the throbbing in his skull. His body felt hollowed out, a vessel drained of all but the barest remnants of fight. The adrenaline that had fueled his desperate gambit had fled, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion that seeped into his bones, promising only oblivion. Through the gaping, ruined wall of his cell, the vast, empty hangar bay was now clearer. Smoke still swirled in languid currents, catching the flickering emergency lights that occasionally pulsed from the distant service tunnels. But the absence was absolute. No stargazer. No sleek lines of a diplomatic vessel, no comforting hum of its engines, no promise of escape. Just a yawning, echoing void. Bria North, Keaton Vire, the 312 souls Kalen had saved from the primary manifold's destabilization. Their fate was now an open wound, unspoken, but understood. They were gone, consumed by the chaos, perhaps caught in the same devastating shockwave that had shredded the very structure of the Xylos station. He was alone. No comm unit, no data module, no ship, no crew. Just a broken body and a hollow victory. The truth, the Zorlinth frequencies, the raw data of Project Chimera, the proof of the Confederacy's silent internal sabotage. It had been blasted into the Xylos network. It was out. Beyond immediate quarantine. The lie of a spontaneous cascade failure was now exposed for the calculated betrayal it always had been. But the cost was everything. He thought of the Vanguard, her deck plates bucking violently in her final moments, the frantic drumbeat of his own pulse against her death rattle. He had been blamed then for not trusting the automated systems, for his human fallibility. Now that same fallibility, that raw, desperate human touch, had ripped a hole in the fabric of their engineered deception. He had proven his distrust right, exposed their trap. But there would be no accolades, no recognition. He wasn't a hero. He was a criminal, a saboteur, a ghost returned from the past to shatter their carefully constructed future. And the universe, vast and indifferent, would barely register the tremor. The cold seeped deeper into his broken body, a vast echoing emptiness settling in his core, matching the void in the hangar bay. He closed his eyes, the metallic taste of blood still heavy on his tongue, the lingering acrid scent of burning life a constant companion. The system was exposed, yes. The truth was out there, somewhere, vibrating through the cold, indifferent conduits of the galaxy. But he, the instrument of that truth, was merely another piece of debris left to decay in the silence after the storm. His fight was done. The consequences were clear. The ultimate irony was not a bitter pill to swallow, but the very air he struggled to breathe. The universe listened, but it would not care, not for one broken man. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.